Hello everyone, and welcome to the first of our Risk and Regulation Summit webinars brought to you by Building Design and Housing Today. My name is Carl Brown. I'm the Head of Content at Assemble Media Group, and I'm chairing this first session, which is sponsored by Fenwick Elliott, entitled The Building Safety Act, Navigating Gateways 2 and 3. This session, as we all know, is very timely. The mammoth 262-page Building Safety Act passed into law last month, and it's intended to create lasting generational change to the way residential buildings are constructed and maintained following the tragic events at Grenfell 5 years ago. In the next 12 to 18 months, the Act's second and third gateway points will come into effect through regulations which have yet to be finalised or published, and we will be discussing what this is all likely to mean for the construction and housing industries with our panel, we've got a fantastic panel today who I'm now going to introduce. We have Simon Tolson, who's a senior partner at Fenwick Elliott, Andrew Mellor, who's a partner at PRP, and Dr. Holly Liang, who's the Fire and Life Safety Director at AESG. Each of our panelists will speak for around 7 to 8 minutes, which should give us plenty of time for your questions at the end. And we would encourage you to ask questions to the panel. To do this, you should be able to see a chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and all you have to do is pop your question and your name into that, and I'll try and get to as many of them as I can in the second half of the session. Feel free also to talk about the event on social media. Give it a shout. The hashtag is Risk and Reg 2022. But that's all from me. So I'm now going to hand over to Simon Tolson of Fenwick Elliott for the first of the presentations. Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's just see if I get the technology right here. Yes, here we go. Right, if I can just share my screen in the usual way. Right, well, first of all, just a very brief introduction. I'm Simon Tolson, the senior partner of Fenwick Elliott. I've been involved in construction disputes pretty well all my qualified career, so over 35 years now. And this act that we're going to be talking about and these gateways, but particularly the act, is probably the most significant piece of legislation that's affected my career, certainly since probably the Building Act of 1984. Just a little bit of an introduction in terms of giving you all some context, and I appreciate some of you have probably been immersed in the Act hugely in one way or another over the last couple of years since the first draft came out in July 2020, but as I think nearly everyone will be aware, the royal assent for the Act was given at the end of April on the 28th. It was only on the 16th of May that the text of the Act was actually fully available and published. And interesting, just in terms of timing, the Fire Safety Act, some of which provisions are still not in force, was brought into force in relation to royal assent almost exactly a year prior to that. In relation to, say, context, it's always helpful for some of the viewers that may not be too familiar with the background, but it all stems very largely from the tragic Grenfell fire in June 2017. The two strands you see on the screen there is the public inquiry on the left and independent review on the right. And in terms of the public inquiry, again, Sir Martin Morbick, who's been constantly in the news and all media pretty well since the beginning of this process, is effectively the chair of the inquiry. And that inquiry, which has followed a very carefully planned timetable, but like a lot of timetables, programs or schedules that construction folk are familiar with, has suffered some extensions of time requirements, partly because of the imposition of COVID and also because of general availability issues with witnesses, etc., in such a very large process. So anyway, phase one, the factual narrative has taken place. Phase two, we're in the middle of at the moment, and we're at mode 6 presently, looking at designers and contractors' liabilities as well as a few other issues. Dame Judith Hackett published her initial report in 2017. That made a number of recommendations in relation to radically enhancing and improving building regulation in this country, which was essentially demonstrated to be ineffective and dysfunctional. Her recommendations in the final report, of which there were 53, have made their way into the Act now. And as you'll be hearing from other speakers today, whilst we have the Act in force, it is a piece of enabling legislation, and the delegated legislation, the majority of it is not finally settled. So anything that we're discussing today, this morning, will actually be subject potentially to change and further comment. It is live legislation in that sense. So as you heard at the commencement of this webinar, the Act itself is a pretty large tome, 250 odd pages, 171 sections, plus 8 lots of delegated legislation. It really does genuinely represent what I've said there as a paradigm shift in the way residential buildings are designed, built, managed and regulated, but it also affects really the entire building process, construction and design process of any structures. And we will see creep inevitably, in my opinion, in relation to within scope buildings, potentially moving into buildings that are not within that definition, which I'll come to a little bit later. So it revolutionizes the way that we design, build and effectively produce buildings within this country. Speaking to main contractors, of which I act for a number, there are numbers being sort of quoted or suggested about what the effect is on increased costs. Ultimately, everyone is going to be paying more for buildings and certainly within scope buildings going into the future, and really from about now. 20% is a number that I've heard some saying 25% increase. Like a lot of things in government, they have to produce these impact assessments on the effect of the change of legislation to see what it can be costed out in terms of kind of cost benefit analysis. And they've costed it at 426 million reoccurring as the cost to the industry. I think that's going to be probably very light indeed. So that's probably all I want to say on that slide for now. But as I mentioned, we've had 5 years in one sense to prepare for this legislation. The significance of this legislation in relation to that period is the effect that it's likely to have in terms of what judges will take judicial notice of. And that's a kind of warning I give to the industry, that the run up to this legislation and the fact that it's still developing is going to impute a certain level of knowledge, let's say, in relation to the entire process, which will make it difficult for defendants in actions under the Act to resist some of the implications, of which there are very wide ones, in relation to the sanctions that are available. But again, that's a subject for another talk. We've got the extended limitation period, which others will be talking about on this building program in a later webinar. The limitation extensions obviously are pretty radical. The implications for the industry in terms of availability of professional indemnity insurance are acute in already what is a horrifically hard market. So there's a lot of change to be absorbed by the industry in what is now a very short time of the 18 to 24 months in relation to the implementation. I won't spend very much on this slide because, again, I'm sure most of you are aware of it. The Act is split into 6 main parts. Parts 2 and 3, sorry, 3 and 4 are really the main guts of the Act. And it's available now, as I say, on the statute web pages for the government websites, and you'll be able to obviously download it in various forms. I've got a nice handy copy in the office on my desk as I'm being referred to it or needing to refer to it pretty regularly at present. With the legislation, I just mentioned there are 8 statutory instruments. What is interesting, and I mentioned it to a couple of speakers earlier on today, is that for example, the Building Higher Risk Buildings England Regulations 2022, which were available for some months, vanished on the government websites about 2 days ago, and you cannot now get a copy. And I've checked again this morning just before coming on this program. But those sets of delegated legislation or statutory instruments are going to be developing. So the square brackets are basically because they're not finally settled. So just be aware of them. We'll be talking about certainly this one, number 7, a few times today. So what I want to focus on in the next 6 or 7 minutes is basically some major issues that I see, and focus a little bit on how projects are procured and what contracts and appointments might need to say. As I kind of emphasised there and have indicated already, it is a bit of a moving target because of some of the uncertainty with draft statutory instruments. Royal assent actually has been achieved far sooner than many of us thought. I got a tip off back in February it was going to happen in April, but most people thought it was going to happen in 2023, and suddenly it's upon us, and the clock in terms of the transitional arrangements is upon us, with some of the provisions coming in, including limitation ones, within 2 months. The biggest impact I see of the changes in relation to what we're talking about today in terms of the gateway process is on developers, design teams, principal designers, principal contractors. That's really where the very hub of this is kind of centered. And the gateway process obviously also has a strong nexus to the golden thread, which again, a later program in this webinar series will be touching on. Change management, essentially the design brief by stage 2 has to be settled. Making changes on the hoof during construction is now not going to be a practice that is one that is an enjoyable venture because of the difficulties with regard to what that causes with the gateway process and the building safety regulator. I won't be focusing on any particular form of contract because a lot of these provisions apply more generally to various contracts. The domestic contract, obviously, in terms of the most popular used in the UK, is still the JCT family in the design and build form, the 2016 edition, which will be hugely amended in the next edition that you come across. So these regulations, when I'm talking about regulations, I'm talking about the higher risk buildings, the HERBs, as some people call them, regs. And they cover the building control process, change control, the golden thread, and so on. Now, Gateway 1, which we're not going to be talking about on this program or this webinar, is already in force. It's not strictly part of the Building Safety Act, and that is the planning gateway. Gateway 2 is similarly important because effectively these gateways are really hold stops, as I put there, kind of borrowed from the whole point control process that some of you may know something about from the nuclear industry, which I've had some involvement with, where whole point control operates to strictly really condition the progress of a contract design process through its key stages. And we have the same thing in offshore oil and gas, and it's been brought very sensibly and advocated about by Dame Judith Hackett, that it should be something we follow in construction in this country. And now, for the first time, we have a process that has it. So it is also part of the very strong message that government gives us that there shouldn't be a race to site and a race to the bottom situation in relation to how we build and procure buildings. And it's going to have a very huge impact, as I'm sure we will see in these few slides. The process that we're currently going through, and as I say, the transitional arrangements mean that until about October 2023, the current deposited plans or full plans procedure will continue, but there will obviously be a point when the changeover arises. So as I say, the scope of this applies to higher risk buildings, and those are buildings over 18 meters in height or 7 stories, and buildings such as care homes and hospitals which meet those same criteria. But the gateway process affects the entire design team. The importance of the design team in terms of probably having a design team leader now is probably more important than ever. but it impacts developers and contractors, particularly those doing design and build in relation to getting ready for Gateway 2. Remembering Gateway 2 is still a pre-construction stage. It's before anyone brings a shovel or anything onto site. It is the stage that has to be cleared before construction can commence. So as I say, the process at the moment is relatively expeditious, even on a deposited plans or full plans process, in terms of getting building regulation consent or initial notice to commence on site. It normally takes, in fact, it's actually set at 5 weeks. We're going to have a much longer process in relation to Gateway 2 of 12 weeks and potentially more. So I've dealt with point 3 really in terms of HERBs or HRBs just a moment ago. The sort of information that has to be supplied with a Gateway 2 application is pretty voluminous, because you've got so many elements of information that have to be demonstrated and provided in terms of drawings, notations, demonstrating escape routes, where sprinklers are. The Gateway 2 process has to also demonstrate how proposals comply with the functional requirements of the building regulations, but taking, as government has prescribed, a holistic consideration of all building regulations, so that it's not looked at purely elementally, but how the building is actually going to behave. And that's obviously very critical to fire and structural and building safety in that sense. There are some grey requirements. There are various things which are going to have to be properly defined. I've said there in the slide, definitions for construction control plan and design and build approach document and fire and emergency file were in Schedule 1 to the regulations for higher risk buildings, but as I say, at the moment not currently available to view on the government websites. But the government fact sheet that was available until the weekend does say building regulations should be considered holistically with this outcome-focused approach, and all plans and documents must be realistic for the building and not rely on unreasonable assumptions about the occupied building. So there needs to be a lot more forethought in relation to the design submission at Gateway 2, and assumptions need to be reasoned, and they need to be done in that way so that the plausibility of them for the building safety regulator is something that they accept. If they don't, it'll be thrown back at you and you will have to resubmit. So going around the houses is a genuine concern, but I think we'll find a little bit of that happening in the early stages once the Gateway processes commence. I've said that duty holders should not compliance with building regulations as a tick box exercise. So practical things to consider, certainly within my office at the moment on new projects and tenders that we're vetting and reviewing with our clients, the question of sitting down with the design team and reviewing the current arrangements. In the delegated legislation in these regs, Regulation 4 is about the requirement to pass Gateway 2. I can only assume it having been removed from the website for the government web pages for the Act, that it's probably being amended and updated in the next few days, so watch that space. I've said there, what's different to the current plans check-in regime is really the level of additional work in actually providing and preparing the submittal. And I've also said there, unless there's more guidance, unless there is more guidance, the design team and contractors are likely to price assumptions. Now, obviously in the real world, contractors have to price assumptions. They can't price every permutation of assumption, otherwise their numbers will be far too high. And one of the things that lots of you as contractors and the pricing departments of your businesses will be concerned with is trying to get those assumptions right and understand what assumptions are the real ones to be allowing for. The other interesting thing is, and we'll see whether this is there in the revision to the regulations, is that the version that was available until last week in Regulation 4 subclause F allowed for a staged approach to Gateway 2. Now this could be with a phased or a sectional approach to the construction of the development. Obviously some projects are going to be very large, as well as in addition to being taller than 18 meters with some resi units within them. And so a staged approach is, I think, a sensible, intelligent one that government's anticipated, but we'll have to see how that develops. In terms of procurement, if I've got time at the end of my slides, I think almost certainly that the impact on procurement of the gateway process is that we're going to see a prevalence of two-stage DB. I'm not saying that that doesn't exist now because it's still very, very prevalent, but I think the two-stage process with the information and collaboration that comes from the contractor being involved in the first stage of the tender and the development of the project will have huge benefits in relation to getting ready for Gateway 2. And I think single stage tendering is less likely to be viable in the traditional procurement sense. Obviously, it depends on the project, but I'm talking about the more sizable projects. So that's why I posit maybe the end of single stage design and build. Obviously, the situation with main contracts, they're being entered into all the time. A lot of questions are being asked about, well, the main contract was entered into, say, 3 or 4 months ago. The Act is now in force since the end of April. I'm haggling on my subcontract at this point. You know, what's likely to be the position? What sort of risks should I be taking into account? One of the things I said, the first thing on the slide there, is a clear matrix of responsibility for Gateway 2 requirements, along with dealing with any assumptions made, is something that you really need to be talking about with those that you are negotiating with. The implications of Gateway 2 not being passed are, of course, very serious, and there needs to be a risk allocation in relation to where that sits with the employer, the design team, etc. The obligation, remember, is not to start work until Gateway 2 is passed. You can't make a soft start. Even I think site setup might be a bit of an issue. So they are really big implications here. The implication of staged approval process I was talking about a moment ago. There may be complications. I've said there, consider all the what ifs of a staged approval process. You really want to be sure about the phasing and the sectionalization of contracts before you get to Gateway 2, and think through whether in fact it might be sensible perhaps not to have 4 or 5 sections, but maybe only 1 or 2. The implications of the 12-week period with the statutory building regulator. We know that 12 weeks is what we're all having to potentially factor into the process. For developers, time is money, and that is a cost. It is a consideration in particular if the building safety regulator is not sufficiently manned. I think they've got about 200 staff presently. I know they're advertising for 1,400. Will they have enough in 14 months' time? Well, you know what it's like. I'm not quite so sure they will. Implications for delay, therefore, in terms of the building safety regulator. Right, I think I will move on to the next slide. During the work between Gateways 2 and 3, obviously the question about change management is a very key one. Our industry has, and it's been very much criticised, particularly by Dame Judith Hackett in her reports about the VE nature of basically repricing and redesigning, or going to the lowest common denominator type arrangement in terms of options and costs to try and get a building built more cheaply, you know, lower quality lifts, lower quality specifications, maybe alternative manufacturers who can produce plants and equipment and building products at lower cost into the market. So we can expect to see far less VE, mainly because of the complications that changing your Gateway 2 submittal is extremely cumbersome now, or will be more cumbersome, because of having to go back through the hoop in terms of making changes. So that is, I say, a very important point if the design is not in accordance with the plans that are submitted. There are 2 types of changes that the regulations refer to, notifiable changes.
I'd like you to hurry up, please.
Yes. Okay. Well, I will speed up, but just mentioning the 2 types of changes there. So really, what I suppose I wanted to emphasize is that a lot of alterations will need to be made in the contracts that we're using currently, JCT and the NEC family in particular, to accommodate the changed arrangements with the gateway processing. And a lot of solicitors are now engaged in drafting those changes, and you're beginning to see articles in relation to them, but it's only just beginning. So I think what I'll basically really want to say finally is Gateway 3, as a lawyer, I see potentially vexed questions about how PC is defined in the building contracts and what the complications will potentially amount to where you do not get from the building safety regulator an occupation certificate to allow the building to be occupied, even though as the contract defined practical completion at the time it was signed, it did not have a Gateway 3 process in it. So I've dealt pretty well with the procurement difficulties. So if I could end at that particular point, Carl, that was probably the right point.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. A really comprehensive roundup there of the background of the Act, its origins through the Grenfell inquiry and the Hackett review, and a few warnings about the potential legal sanctions, liabilities, and major issues for the construction industry. I'm now going to hand over to Andrew Mellor, a partner at PRP. Andrew, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to pick up where Simon's been left off and take you through a bit more of the detail of the gateways. So what we imagine post Gateway 1, which is your plan application, that you're going to be, as you do with building control at the moment, approaching them about some pre-application support. What we know is that the HSE are now considering what level of support they're going to offer right through the gateway process. So we imagine there will be some pre-application support, but we don't know what level it will be at the moment. But they're going to assign a project officer, a senior officer, which effectively will be the case officer for the project through the gateway process, and they will be supported by other disciplines within the HSE, structural engineering, fire engineer, or whatever it will be. What we should make clear here is that the gateways don't apply just to new buildings, they apply to existing buildings where proposed notifiable works are included. So recladding projects, conversion projects, projects which are extensions to existing relevant buildings will all fall under the gateway system. So here, what I've listed is what we know at the moment, and Simon covered some of these that will have to be submitted as Gateway 2. And to be clear, this replaces the full plans building regulations application. So you are going to be producing a full set of detailed plans. Now, Simon talked about the staged approach, and as I'm aware, you will be considered by the building safety regulator whether your project is high risk or not. If it's high risk, you will need to produce a full set of detailed plans. Whether that includes the details related to the fire alarm system, the things that are relatively minor in terms of design, and could be dealt with later on, I don't yet know. But the staged approach could be very much like the Scottish approach called the warrant system, where you submit the first application relates to the substructure of the building, so the structural elements below ground. So that gets approved, and then you can start to put the foundations in. And then while you're working on the foundations, you submit for the superstructure. And certainly that application will have to cover the detailed requirements of the structural elements as well as the fire safety elements of the superstructure of the building. It may include other items as well, but from what I understand, there could be a third application which includes other items such as ventilation, thermal performance, etc., to allow you move your building forward and not cause delay. But a high risk building may have to be all that information submitted at one time. And when I did work for government, we determined that was going to put at least a 6-month delay on a project for a developer if you had to prepare all that information up front rather than the staged approach. We're going to have a competence statement. So the accountable person, the client, the developer, is responsible for checking the competency of the very least the principal designer and the principal contractor, as well as the other designers. So they're going to prepare this competence statement to say that we've checked the competence of the people we've appointed to undertake these works and as our consultant team, and here is the competence evidence to prove that. We are then going to have these detailed plans and specifications, particularly on fire safety and structural, as I said, and that's going to be down to the designers, but it's going to be down to the principal designer, which is different to your traditional CDM designer. They're responsible for ensuring that the design of the building is compliant with the building regulations. So they're going to be all over those documents, but it begs the question about whether the principal designer has got the expertise or the range of expertise that's required to do that. You need to submit a fire and emergency file, but I'm not going to go into detail on that. I'm going to let Holly, the next speaker, pick up on that. You need to submit a golden thread approach statement. So this is effectively how you are recording the decision making and the approval process. And I think that will fall to the principal designer. A construction control plan. So this is prepared by the principal contractor, which sets out how the building will meet the building regulations during the construction phase of the project, if such that it changes, there are changes during that time. And a change control plan. So Simon mentioned the major changes, the notifiable changes. So you need a change control plan about how those changes will be dealt with within the project team and then notified to the building safety regulator. And a mandatory occurrence reporting approach. So this is effectively whistleblowing. So it's where those attending site, if they see a risk, and we're not talking health and safety risk in terms of construction process here, we're talking about a risk in an occupied building. So I'm installing the cavity barriers in the facade the wrong way around, or the steel work erector is not bolting the steel work. If I notice those things, I'll be duty bound to report that to the building safety regulator. But there has to be something in the system within the project to allow me to do that. And that's what that approach statement is. So during the construction, we are going to get some changes. We always get some changes because that manufacturer's gone out of business on a Friday night and we've got to find a new product on the Monday morning. We've got major changes and these other notifiable changes. And as Simon said, major changes, you can't proceed with the work on site until you've got that. And these really will be major changes. And I think very unlikely to happen on many projects. So a major change, as I see them, could well be that you decide to add 2 more stories onto the top of the building, or you decide that you've got to reconfigure the escape staircase for some reason that was unknown when you started the project on the site. So there really will be major changes. Other notifiable changes perhaps could be that that manufacturer of that cavity barrier has gone out of business over the weekend. You've got to find another one. But that other product is exactly the same performance and has got the same testing certification. So it's a like-for-like product, and therefore it's a notifiable change. But what happens there is you proceed with that work at risk on site until such time as the building safety regulator has acknowledged it. So there will be some potential for delay. My expectation is there will be very few changes on each development, as Simon said, for various reasons, for avoidance in terms of delay and additional costs and further risks. So Gateway 3, the building is now complete and you are ready to hand it over in relation to building regulations matters. Of course, you still might be decorating, you still might be working on landscape, but you got to submit this Gateway 3 application before you can occupy the building in whole or part. And originally the building safety regulator, well, DLUC, as was developing the policy, determined that you could only occupy the building in a whole. They've now come around to the fact that you will be able to partially occupy the building, and therefore you'll be doing partial occupation applications through Gateway 3. And again, we're yet to fully understand that. What's really important to understand here is we need all the documentation that was submitted with Gateway 2 to be updated to the as-built conditions. So there's going to be a period at the end of the construction, unless we're dealing with it during the process of construction, of updating all the drawing information, the 3D model, etc., all the documentation that was submitted, and submitting that to the building safety regulator at the time. So the duties will fall again down to principal contractor and principal designer for updating those. The digital record, at some time, Dame Hackett was advocating the use of a 3D BIM model as a digital record and asset tagging information into that model. And I still foresee that many residential development clients will do that, particularly those who are maintaining the buildings for asset management purposes. But now it will be more simplistic key data set, which will be around the height of the building, the tenure, the mix of uses, number of staircases, construction materials, etc. within that key data set, and more akin to a spreadsheet. Again, there are other things there that I'm sure Holly's going to cover, so I won't cover those. We've got this resident engagement strategy, which is how the principal accountable person, so we have potentially numerous accountable persons, but this is effectively the freeholder of the building at the point of handover. So how will they engage with the residents and discuss risks and help them to mitigate risks in the building? And that's going to be set out and submitted at Gateway 3. And the safety case for a new build building, which is also down to the principal accountable person, will be effectively a statement to say we've been through all this process, we've complied with all the requirements, and therefore our building is safe as I see it. There will be, and there's still some debate about this, no more building completion certificate from building control. There will now be declarations, I understand, signed by the client, the developer, the principal designer and principal contractor, says best of our knowledge this building complies with the building regulations. Once all that's approved, the building safety regulator will issue a building assessment certificate which allows occupation of the whole building if that's what you've applied for, or partial occupation of the building. So just for me, my final slide is that this phase completion is really important, and I think it's coming back into vogue. We're hearing more and more developers considering it, particularly around cash flow and in the current sort of financial circumstances we're in as an industry. But this preparation of as-built document, I think, is key to be considering doing that during the construction process rather than wait until the end, as we have perhaps done in previous years and currently, because that's only going to delay the handover of the building, which no one wants. What we don't know yet is what the refusal process and the approval and refusal process is going to be from the building safety regulator. The refusal process could simply be it's refused and you get no guidance or commentary, or it could be refusal with comments, or it could be refusal with comments and here's our guidance, which I think we're all in the industry going to need for the first few applications to help us to understand how the building safety regulator is considering things. And just one final thing for me, which is really important, I think, is that the principal contractor has got to be on board, of course, for Gateway 2, because it's them that's going to submit the information. The principal contractor doesn't have to be the main contractor, but I think typically will, which means they're brought forward in the process much earlier, so that the design of the building is much more detailed at Gateway 2, and we're going to have the contractor on board before we submit what is effectively the building regulations application. Thank you, that's me.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Lots and lots of really useful detail there about the requirements and responsibilities under the gateway system at the various points. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Holly Liang of AESG. Holly, over to you.
Hi. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Liang, and I'm the Director of Fire Life Safety at AESG. For those who are not familiar with AESG, we are a specialist engineering consultancy advisory firm headquartered in London and Dubai, working throughout the UK, Europe, Asia, and Middle East. We got 6 core specialist services: fire life safety, sustainability, facade, acoustic, commissioning, and environment. These are some examples of our key projects we worked on across the world. As a fire engineer, our role has been throughout the whole life cycle of the project, from the planning, which Gateway 1 has been applied. We are providing the national fire statement for buildings for projects around the country. We also comply with the London Plan 2021 and provide the fire statement for that. And during the design construction stage, we prepare all the design fire strategies, assist all the design and the coordination in post-occupation as well. So, as you all know, after Grenfell Tower tragedy, a significant number of changes have been made relating to the building safety. We are trying to keep up to date. One of the major changes is the introduction of Building Safety Act, which will replace the long-existing legislation, the Building Act 1984. Andrew and Simon has already mentioned quite a bit of this act in detail, so I'm not going to cover that. The Building Safety Act has just been granted the royal assent last month and is due to come in force in next year following the Parliament scrutiny. There are a number of changes has been introduced in this Building Safety Act. One of the key changes is the introduction of the gateway system. This government has created the new gateway system to ensure that building safety risks are considered at each stage of the building planning, design, construction, and pre-occupation. All three gateways are intended to create a golden thread of safety information about a building, ensuring the right information is available to the right people at the right time. As the two presenters already mentioned, Gateway 1 is the planning application stage. It has came in force last year in August and deal with the planning permission phase and early considering of the fire safety. In this stage, fire engineers being involved at the very beginning of the project, we assist the planning application, consider all the key fire safety measures, including means of escape, firefighting, fire system provisions, all those activities we need to consider at this stage. There's the Gateway 2, which occurs just before the construction stage, and its application, including full design intention, has to be provided to approve the building regulator, but before the construction work begins. This provides a very hard stop point until the approval is being received. Gateway 3 is at the completion stage of the construction and pre-occupation phase. It is the completion, there's a completion and final certificate phase at which the duties will include handover of the relevant documents to both the regulator and the building owner. If approved, the regulator will issue a completion certificate and the high-risk residential building will be registered on the regulatory system. A building cannot be occupied until the Gateway 3 process has been completed satisfactorily. All three gateways are intended to create a golden thread of safety information through the whole life cycle of the building. This makes perfect sense to me, and I have no doubt that it will enhance the building safety significantly with the new Building Safety Act in force. However, I see there are challenges we're anticipating in the entire industry. There's a big gap between what the new law says and what we can actually achieve in the short term. First one is unclear of the detailed information to be stored. There's no clear guidance on what level of details for the information to be stored. It is correct that the information will be detailed in the second legislation, but there's a concern about the time length when the second legislation comes through. Second is missing information for the existing buildings. It might be difficult or almost impossible to trace back the full list of information for many of the existing buildings. And third is lack of industry-wide benchmark criteria. There's a delay in defining the product safety criteria. Then the next one is the short of capacity. The new gateway system will create a higher demand for competent fire professionals. Or you already know that we are currently already shortage in this resource. And also there's a backlog for the fire lab testing, project contract, program, and funding. Since the Gateway 2 plays a hard stop for construction work, the design and build contract will not be suitable. As Simon and Andrew already mentioned, so I'm not going to talk more details, and there will be lack of funding, in particular relating to the internal fire safety systems, and also it's questionable who will pay for the fees when the occupants or the construction completed but the planning certificate is not received, where the tenants are not allowed to be in the building. And also there will be consideration about most spending on the existing building remedy work, such as cladding. There will be less focus and fee on the developing of new buildings as well. There's unclear of the time frame for each gateway and approval process. Challenging to plan and meet the project program. And the last one is increase of professional indemnity insurance and unable to cover full scope of fire engineering service, such as the external works. To avoid surprise, what can we be prepared before the Building Safety Act coming forth. As consultants, we were considering in the design, we're trying to involve in projects at the very beginning, which is already started for many projects because we need the planning application. And then second is enhance the performance, provide optimized solution to meet both technical requirements and commercial requirements. Where possible, we assess the impact of coming fire safety guidance and apply to current projects as necessary. We do space proofing for at least 5 to 10 years time. We provide in the project whole life cycle, we clarify the ownership to store information for each project at each stage clearly, and record all relevant information digitally and centrally. AESG has already developed a Fire Plus last year, and we start to apply in some more projects. So hopefully this will be get us ready before the Gate 2 stays released. And we involve the clients and contractors at the beginning of the project and plan contracts and program accordingly. The last one is the resource. We put in place a very short training program to improve the competence of each individual, check competence of a person who undertake the work, and we put in place internal process to enable them to comply with the reporting obligations. We're trying to stay on top of the industry. I'm sure there are a lot more to talk about the coming Building Safety Act, and those are the highlighted items that's related to current industry. I'm happy to talk more later if you want to discuss separately. That's from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. And that was a really useful summary there of the information gaps and challenges with the Act, along with one or two things the industry can do to prepare. I'm delighted to say we've had lots and lots of questions from the audience, and we've got around 15 minutes or so to try and get through some of these. So I'm going to launch straight into the questions. So I think first we'll go, we've got a question from James Whitaker, and he wants to know, do you think, for Gateway 2, do you think there will be any acceptable situation where certain construction works can commence before full Gateway 2 approval? For instance, could we start foundation works before full regulator approval for the superstructure is received? I don't know, Simon, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I think particularly once, if you're one of the first into the process with Gateway 2 coming in, I suspect more caution's needed. I think probably what might be allowed is site setup, putting the hoardings up, putting the site offices, the porta cabins onto the site. That's probably about as far as you can go. Maybe putting lay down area, hard standings down is probably going to be permitted, but substantive building work, I think the building safety regulator is probably not going to be keen on sanctioning that, because where do you draw the line? I could see problems with that.
Is there anything to add to that, Andrew or Oli?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. If you're allowed to do a phased application, because if you've got approval for your foundations for a phased application, you can proceed with that before you do your substructure application. But if it's a full application, no, you can't start until you've got approval for that full application.
Yeah, I think as you said, Andrew, the phased aspect of it, which I just touched on briefly, is actually going to be very important to get clarified, isn't it, when these regulations get updated, because of all of the reasons that you said, and you know, in terms of how projects are planned, a phased approach is sometimes, you know, an advantage for funding, etc.
Okay, thank you, Simon. We've had a number of questions about design. We have several questions about design. I've just taken a couple of these together. So Joel Youngberg wants to know, is it clear the level of design detail that will be needed at Gateway 2? Does it get right down to product and system in any areas of the building? And then we've got Stuart Mills, who is saying, if having to go back through Gateway 2 due to changes in design, how would that impact progress on the site? So does anybody have something they want to say on those two questions.
I can come in on some of the level of detail questions. So in my work with DLUC, and this is not absolutely finalised, but we've had lots of discussions about level of detail required. So particularly on fire safety and structural safety were the things that they wanted to focus on in the Gateway 2 application to make sure they were fully approved. So for example, if you were doing your facade design, yes, you would have had to have specified your product for your cladding, for your insulation, and for your cavity barriers at that point. But we said to them, would you have had to have specified your fire alarm system, because that's not directly connected to the superstructure design. And they felt that if that was going to be included in a phase 3 application, the things like the fire alarm design could be included, or the sprinkler design could be included in a later stage 3 effectively application, the less it affected the facade or the superstructure, which of course a sprinkler tank may do. I mean, it's definite, Carl, that we're going to be doing more detailed design. I'm fairly certain than we ever were at that stage, at building regulations application stage.
Holly, is that something you would agree with?
Yeah, and also I just want to add on top of that, in terms of design fire safety side, the gateway system may not information that much details, but there are standards like British standards guidance or ADB. They are coming in change, and they are parallel with that as well. Yeah, so let's, for example, the residential building, the draft BS 9991 already come out, and so the published for consultation, and some of the design we are already started to consider those impacts on our current project.
I was just going to say, Carl, also, I think that one thing that's quite useful as at least guidance at this point is the RIBA have published some pretty useful guidance for architects, obviously on the potential that they're principal designer for projects, of what sort of information, drawn information, notations, etc., should be shown on drawings. So there are some examples. I mean, they're not law yet, of course, but they're not law at all. But you know, it is being emphasised what sort of information. The other thing is that in relation to what Andrew was talking about within scope buildings, where you're adding, say, some stories on top of the building and it becomes more than 18 meters, is the need to actually, and Holly mentioned this as well, is survey and ascertain the as-built structure and understand it, because it's so difficult to make assumptions about things where the structure doesn't have very much historic drawn information, and you're going to have to go in refurbishment and sort of development of an existing building, like happens in London quite a lot. You're going to have to do a lot more work as a contractor and design team.
Okay, thanks, Simon. I think I'd like to move on now and talk a bit about competency. So Rebecca Campbell from the audience wants to know what evidence will be required to demonstrate competence. And I'd also be interested to know what the accountable person needs to be doing kind of in the run-up to all of this to be assured of competence of the various, you know, the designer, the contractor, etc., etc. So who would like to take that one?
I mean, I can come in.
Fire industry probably is, sorry, from our fire industry probably it's very clear. The chartership is one of the key requirements at the moment. So like when you are preparing fire statement or planning application, you need to have a chartered engineer to be able to carry out this type of work, and also for external work as well.
On the PD, principal designer and principal contractor, there is a publicly accessible specification that's been developed by the British Standards Institute, and you will have to be accredited under that to be appointed as a PD or PC. So there'll be third-party accreditation. You'll take a series of examinations or provide evidence, and you'll be then third-party accredited. The question is, will there be anyone who has that when this kicks in October 2023? And will there be enough people to service the projects? Undoubtedly not. So how it's going to work at that point, we don't know. From an architect's perspective, as myself, we know that the ARB, under the new Architects Act changes, will now be requiring us to do our CPD rather through the RIBA, through the ARB, and we believe there were a whole series of competency examinations in relation to health and safety, fire safety, and other matters. So that's how I'll demonstrate that I've got that expertise to clients, but also from the wider practice that we've been working on tall buildings for a period of time. We've got all this due diligence processes in place, etc.
Yeah, I think you're right. Specialist architects doing tall buildings and consultants doing tall buildings, and the know-how that they have, they can exhibit, and you know, you can demonstrate that as design teams. But you're going to have to produce sort of documents that, you know, satisfy the regulator. I think for young people obviously coming into the professions now, so looking like a bit forward in terms of the crystal ball, obviously the competency level of the professions will be that much higher because that training is there. But it's continuing professional education of a really intensive kind that's going on now. So yeah, exactly as Andrew's saying.
Okay, we'll move on. We've got around 5 minutes, so let's try and get through some more questions. Dave Brown says, at Gateway 3, who do you see producing the safety case, the construction team or the landlord, or a matrix of both?
Do you want me to try and answer that? I mean, safety case is absolutely down to the principal accountable person. So it's the question is so the principal accountable person is the freeholder of the building. One would assume the freeholder of the building is a developer at that point. So it's down to the developer to prepare that. Of course, they may pass that duty on to others, such as the developer, the principal contractor, and principal designer. I suspect they will do, in fact. But I do think it's a fairly simple statement at that point. The safety case will be far more problematic for existing buildings.
Does that accord with your understanding, Simon?
Yeah, no, it does. I think with existing buildings, I mean, unless you're very fortunate and it's been built and the design practices that were involved with it at the time it was built have kept very accurate drawings, and they've got as-builts as well, I think it's going to be a bit of a nightmare. But yes, assuming contracts being entered into with the Act in force now, the level of information after Gateway 2 should, with, as Andrew was saying, I think you're going to have the design updated with the as-built situation moving as a dynamic through the post Gateway 2 process. So hopefully it's not too daunting a situation at the time that has to be handed over to the accountable person. But I think there's going to be collaboration. There's undoubtedly going to be collaboration involved by the design and teams and the developer clients.
Okay, there's a few questions we've had which seem to sort of seek to clarify exactly when these gateways become active at what point. So I just wonder whether we could clear that up. So Charlotte Brogan wants to know, when do these gateways become active for a project, i.e. is it new projects registered for building regulations after the 15th of June? And then we've got Tammay Desai, who says, are gateways 2 and 3 applicable on projects not on site from October 2023? Is there any clarity we can give around those timelines?
I'm not entirely sure there's an emphatic answer that one can give to that. I mean, we know for sure, based on the transitional provisions, that 18 months plus 18 months for gateway process to come in. Gateway 1 obviously is applicable already, but Gateway 2 and 3 will be October 2023. I suspect that in the update of the regulations, there'll be more information about how the definition of basically when that becomes an invocable process on a project that's already let and is on site. There's a lot of questions on this.
I think the original discussions were that if you didn't have your full plans application, building regs application, either registered or your approval notice for full plans, then you would have to do the Gateway 2 process. And if you didn't have your final completion certificates from building controller or approved inspector, then you would have to do the Gateway 3 process. But as Simon said, there's still no clarity around that.
Yeah, I haven't found anything in the Act actually saying that, but I may have missed it.
Is there anything you want to add, Holly, on that, on the timescales and the lack of clarity by the sounds of it on exactly.
Yeah, probably they know better than me as a lawyers.
Okay, that's great. Well, unfortunately, that's about all we've got time for. I'd like to thank all the panelists. We have several more Risk and Regulation Summit webinars over today and tomorrow, so please do register for those. The topics include the golden thread, the UK's product testing sector, and the cladding regime. And remember, the sessions are available, they're live, but they're also available on demand within an hour of the session finishing. We'll also be launching our Social Value Live event on Friday, so watch out for that. We'll be more details about that on Friday. There will also, as we finish, there will be a short feedback survey that pops up on the screen, and it would be great if you could fill that out because it will help us to shape our future events. So yeah, I would like to thank our panelists for one last time. Thank you to Simon, Holly, and Andrew. It's been a great discussion, and this will be available on demand within the hour, I'm told, as well. So thank you very much, guys. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.